joining us for today's program. Today we are going to be having a discussion on gender, or the effects, rather, of gender-based violence on the vulnerable population. And I have as panelists Mrs. Chanel Charles, who is the Senior Gender Officer in the Department of Gender Affairs. Chanel, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Williams.
I also have Mrs. Grace Carr with us, and she'll tell us a little bit about herself later on. And she is representing the migrant women. And I have Mrs. Patricia Richards Leader, who is the Chief Executive Officer at the Grange Healthcare Facility. Welcome, Mrs. Richards Leader.
Thanks for having me.
And I have Mr. Anthony Mills from the St. Kitts and Nevis Association of Persons with Disability. Mr. Mills, welcome.
Thanks.
Right. We are celebrating, or the United Nations has set aside 25th of November to the 10th of December as a 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. Of course, we hear about violence all the time, and violence comes in many forms. It is not only physical. Violence can also be emotional violence. It comes in the form of some kind of abuse, people who are being abused. So you have emotional abuse, you have financial abuse, you have psychological abuse, you have physical abuse, and so on. And that in itself is violence. But before I go any further, I would invite Mrs. Chanel Charles to read for us a poem.
Mr. Williams. And this poem was written by Mrs. Gomes, who was our former Director of Gender Affairs, on the elimination of violence against women, the cost of this social phenomenon. To the 25th to the 10th of December, 16 days the world set aside to focus family, the workplace, and the nation, defies reason and economics, and pose challenges for its accurate calculation. Domestic violence, sexual harassment, economic abuse, impregnating girls before they are ready to be parents, media profiling of women as sex objects, all short-circuit women's potential and often render them further abuse subjects. International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, November 25th. World Human Rights Day, December 10th. Two important days set off this period. We commemorate women's rights are human rights. When women benefit, the whole society they accommodate. Let us give women credit for nation building, family and community development, and for creating our own employment. Human rights activism demonstrate in the Buckley's riot and supportive network for sisters in need. Women hold up more than half the world, indeed. As we commemorate this period, let us remember those who paid the ultimate price, who are silent witness of this human rights vice. The Emerald Sisters of the Dominican Republic, whose execution was ordered by the Trujillo of being in politics when they should be at home kneading dough. The 14 female engineer students of the Montreal Polytechnics who were murdered by Mark Lepin, who claimed they blocked his acceptance. Because of them, he left he could not get a chance. Silent witnesses in our nation are many. Though some may forget, they are fondly remembered by their family. Michelle Weeks, Shamir Norford, and Janice Bolus. If it were not for violence against women, they would be amongst us. Shante Claxton, Lorraine Dorset, and Diana Laplace demonstrate that violence against women respect neither age nor class. 2 double murders in recent history could also be credited to the horror of violence against women. The Brown and Finch sisters are now, because of violence against women's silence. Let us create a violent-free community with kinder, gentler families. For violence is a learned behavior. Our natural inclination is not to kill our neighbor. Lives free of violence is our right. Let us exhibit zero tolerance for violence. As this scourge, we purposely fight.
Thank you very much, Chanel, for that poem that encapsulates so much of what we will be discussing today. But could you give us some, that poem was very comprehensive, but could you give us some background to United Nations 16 days of activism against gender-based violence?
The 16 days campaign was created by the UN Women, and it is celebrated universal, that's all around the world. And each country played their part in bringing forward their activities and getting the world aware or sensitized of violence that are among us. Gender-based violence, I must say, which would include domestic violence. For this year's 16 days campaign, we started our celebration Sunday, where we visited the Zion Moravian Church, and that was that Sunday. Today is the start of 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, which is today the 25th. And our first event this morning was a mock parliament by Scanaipa, our youths of the Federation, and they did our sexual harassment bill. And now we are here to discuss the effects of domestic violence or gender-based violence on the vulnerable population. On the 27th, that's this Friday, we would be in the square to display what we call silent witnesses, or we call them Two Purple People. And we have a domestic violence pledge board where people can sign their name and say, I, Chanel Charles, pledge to support victims of domestic violence. And we should never forget our children. Yes, we have our children to sign a little heart, put on the board to say, yes, they too understand the effects of domestic violence because it happens to their parents and other family members for them. On the 30th of November, our minister would present 2 scholarships to 2 women who have experienced domestic or gender-based violence. And those students would be coming from the AVEC institution. And on the 4th of December, Gender Affairs in St. Kitts and Gender Affairs in Nevis will collaborate in Nevis to also present the silent witnesses and our domestic violence pledge board. Yes, we are sharing with each other because we are sisters. The silent witnesses that we also have one of the members of the board would represent one of the persons who died in Nevis as well. That was a woman. On the 4th also we would wear orange, because that's Wear Orange Day. Because the theme for this year states, like last year, Orange the World. But this year they added fund, respond, prevent, collect. So Orange the World, fund, respond, prevent, collect. So on the 4th, we're asking everybody to join with us and wear the orange. If you want to wear the orange from today, like my boss, you can definitely do that, and up to the 10th of December, which is Human Rights Day. On the 9th of December, we'll have another panel discussion like this one today, and that topic would be on family matters. That's where it will be very interesting for the public to listen in and listen about where we will talk about flexi time, paternity leave, maternity leave, but I won't give you any more. You know, you chime in and listen, and you can give your views.
Okay. Violence, of course, impacts various groups within society, groups that are vulnerable. People usually take advantage of these vulnerable groups. And you mentioned women. Sometimes women is seen as a vulnerable group, women and girls and so on, and they have to be given special protection against violence. And you mentioned the whole thing where women were killed by their male counterparts. Now, it doesn't have to get to that stage, and that is why this awareness is so important. Now, Miss Carr, you represent the migrant women. How has gender-based violence impacted migrant women?
Thank you, Mr. Williams, for that question. I'm delighted to be here representing migrant women, and we know when we speak about migrant women that these are women who are not from the country in which they currently live. In St. Kitts, we have several migrant individuals, not only women, but men and children, families who have come here to seek after better economic situations, work, and so forth. I also am part of JAMKIT, which is an association that comprises Jamaicans and persons who are married to Kittitians and divisions. In my estimation, I sought to familiarize myself again with this word of being vulnerable. And I saw that there were some similar words that were used: defenseless, unguarded, at risk. And I thought that migrant women fall very much in this category. When you come to a foreign country, there are some things that you're not aware of. You're not aware of where some of the different services, social services are. You're seeking after jobs. Some women, they are seeking after love. They want to make sure that they fit into the society. I find that very often that they are preyed upon because of that vulnerability. They are unaware of even some of the laws and structures that are there to protect them. And so I have been here in St. Kitts since 5 years. I must say that personally, I have not experienced, or I cannot say that as a woman, that I'm in that vulnerable position, because I have a good job, I have good support in terms of the employers that I work with, but I know that that is not the case for all of our women who are here on the island. And so I must laud the government or the Gender Affairs Department that has sought to look to see how we can make sure that we do not fall outside of the ambit of what the law stipulates as it relates to providing information, making sure that persons know where to go if it is that there is a challenge in this regard, and so forth. Mm-hmm. Right?
Okay. Now, Mrs. Richards-Leader, you are the head of the Chief Executive Officer at the Grange Healthcare Facility, which means that you are working with older persons in health care. Now, how has gender-based violence impacted that group of persons?
I think that when you look at the work I do, it encompasses all, men and women. if you look at it from a global perspective, it has always been that you'll find more women in care institutions and care homes rather than men, because women feel obliged, and globally, to care for their husbands or spouses. And then when these people die, of course, they've gone through the stress, ill health, and so forth. And more than often, they themselves end up. So there is a gender bias when you come to this thing. But for the last 20 years, on my return to St. Kitts, I actually decided to open an institution, a home, to care for the elder. The international definition of an elder really is someone over the age of 65. We know that is changing, and it's changing drastically. Previous to that, one of my deceased sisters and I had a group in the community called Community-Centered Care. And that was really a precursor to the Grange, where we went out and sought people and employed people to care for them and so forth. St. Kitts is no different to any other country in the world. And apart from the continent of Asia, I think I've worked on every continent. The global incidence of elder abuse is from 3.2 to 27.5%. Of that, 92% is against women. And 90% of elder abuse cases are perpetrated by family members. And more than often, adult children are the most common abusers. Rates can also be high in institutions like mine if you don't ensure that there is effective supervision and managerial issues addressed. So if you know that, say if I know that this is the case, and these are done by studies, you have international bodies that carry out these studies, then you need to put in place a proper system to care for your elders. It's about education. It's not just about giving a bath and feeding. It's about understanding the people that you are caring for. And also, I mean, for instance, in my place, I have 24-hour video and audio surveillance. And it's view anywhere. So if I wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, I want to have a peep, I have a peep. And it's very, very difficult sometimes to make people understand that, look, your merchandise, when you're caring for the elderly, when you're caring for people with comorbidities, people who can't speak, people who can't hear, that you need to have that extra support system to help you out. You also need to be quite eloquent, quite educated about this thing when people say about institutionalized care. Because if you feel that a family member is the best person to care for their own, it is a very wrong perception brought out by all these statistics. Yes, in your own home is the best place, but you have to make sure that that family member is aware of what the aging process is. And when you look at the reasons that they give why a lot of older adults are abused, is caregiver stress. So it was very interesting. I heard on one of the radio stations this morning that the police department has said that during the COVID period, that the incidence of violence shot up. That's what they call the cabin syndrome. You're locked in with someone 24 hours a day, especially during the lockdown period, and there's only so much you could take. Maybe you've got children there, you've got people of all ages, and whereas normally that's good for integration. After a while, It's like being on a cruise with one person. You know, you could only go for 2 weeks. After 3 weeks, you just want to run away from them. It's just too much, you know, and you lash out. You're stressed. And sometimes your own needs are not being met. Last year when I went to the Gerontology Institute workshop in London, 44% of lone caregivers either die, suffer strokes, or have some morbidity issues because they are left, maybe sometimes not alone, but it just becomes too much. Employers need to be aware of who you are putting to care for these people. Do they come highly recommended? Do they have a police record? Don't just take that they used to care for the woman up the road. You don't know what they did. And if they're locked in there for 8-9 hours a day while you go to work, do you know that it's not the dog or cat that ate their food? Who supervises them? So there are a lot of stuff that we need to do, and this should not come from down up. I think it's about time that the government set up an elder abuse prevention unit to look at what incidents. We don't have elder abuse laws. We have domestic violence thing, and you know, they did it in 2000 and they forgot the elders, and it was reviewed in 2005 and they forgot the elders, and that is blatant discrimination. We have a way of whatever doesn't sound good, look good, or whatever we think should be left at home. That's why we call them shut-ins. Well, who shut them in? We shut them in. So we need to expose them to the world, take good care of them, and stop this inherent, intrinsic prejudice that we show against not just women, but everyone. And really and truly, I'm very passionate about it. So if I sound yes, I am. I'm a true advocate. Educate the people who are looking after your people, and not just how to give a baton. Tell them how to look for abuse among the people, and tell them to stop the abuse if they're going. If somebody is supposed to go in to someone to care for them 3 days a week, who's supervising them? How do you know they've gone in 3 days a week? If they've sent them to buy a pound of sugar with $20, how do you know they've given back the change? These are the type of things. Who documents what they've done? Who documents the time they go in and out? Because that is abandonment. It's neglect. Why are you telling them when they die, leave that chair for you? They know they're dying anyway, but they don't want to be reminded just for your material gain. There's a whole wealth of things. So let's have a curriculum that encompasses all this. I could go on and on because I'm very passionate, but I'll leave it there for now because I know that we've got limited time. But I could
yes, but I would like you to go a little bit further. Can you tell us some of the types of abuse that the older persons suffer?
They have physical abuse, and that would be the most apparent because you see scars or you see bruises. So perpetrators take it a different way. There's sexual abuse, and I have encountered two of my residents who told me that they were being abused by their son. And these are not people who are suffering dementia. We have emotional abuse.
Are you saying that their sons were involved with
had
sexual abuse?
Yes, had sexual intercourse with it. And one of them was so seasoned in that she couldn't settle well because, you know, she was missing that was the bond between her and her son. I suppose if I went to the police, they would chase me. Because all that we have here is the law of tort, which means if somebody meets you on the road and boxes in your mouth, you know, you could go to the police. If you've got the onset of dementia, if you can't see well, if you can't hear well, if you don't know how to use a smartphone, because these days most people don't have landlines, you know, they rip the landlines out. Who safeguards them? Where's their safeguard coming from? Who's got the eyes to go in and say, well, this doesn't look right. Why have we got such lovely, wonderful laws protecting children when these people are also classified as minors and there is no law to protect them? Then we have, of course, the financial abuse. In my, and somebody might meet me outside and tell me to go back to England where I was, but the greatest financial abuse comes from family members, ministers of religion, and lawyers, in that order. I have had serious cases of ministers of religion who has people's bank account and so forth. In fact, 2 of them had to be turned to their home because their funds were stripped, up to 180,000. I mean, I'm not talking about pennies here, I'm talking about lots of money. Who do they go to? And then, things like material things, where a relative is abroad and they come home and they find that this person who is not lucid and coherent anymore was taken somewhere and has put their car in the caregiver's name, or the caregiver is walking them to the bank. I've had a recent case where a man was stripped of $60,000. Some young girl was taking him and the girl's boyfriend and so forth and telling him that she's the girlfriend and so they ply on people's weaknesses. And neglect. Neglect is where you are aware that somebody is in there and need care. For example, if you have like the system we have here now in government where we have the home care officers going around, if they're supposed to go every other day or every day for 1 hour and they don't do it, it's neglect. It's as simple as that. Because if they can't do it, they should ring in and say, look, today I can't do it. That old person is at home there, maybe can't give themselves water, suffering dehydration, anything that causes harm. And then we have abandonment, where you just say, I can't do this anymore. You don't tell anybody. You go and you leave the person there, and of course, they suffer irreversible damage. Sometimes they actually die. So if we don't have a good elder abuse prevention unit, and it has to be people who are au fait with elder abuse. You can't say, oh, they had a family, so I can't go in and look. No, you can't go in and look. If a child is neglected, you're going to go in and remove the child. There's a home where you could put the child if you think that the child is, in fact, there are 2 homes. You have the children home and you have the houses home. There's nowhere for older people to go. I think also, if there is a financial thing where you think an old person can't afford to go into a nursing home, because none of the nursing homes that I know of are being subsidized by the government. If you know of any, please let me know, because I would quite happy have some myself. But I think that we, just like children are subsidized in nurseries, the elder people should be subsidized. They should be subsidized, even to help, to buy Pampers in St. Kitts is like taking out a mortgage. It's easier to feed an older person than to buy them Pampers per month. It's these type of things that the unit need to be aware of, to draw attentions to the PSAs and people who are put in this strategic thing, who can't know everything themselves, because there's enough people there to do research. Nobody's ever come and asked me anything, and I've been going for 20 years. So if we're going to create a them and us situation when it comes to vulnerable people, then we're not going to get it solved. And also, we need to also look at the thing that caregiver stress is one of the things, but also substance abuse by family members, that really diminishes their rationality and lucidity of what's going on. So if somebody is high, are they going to remember to feed the older person? So these are some of the things that, Mr. Williams, that these are the main forms of neglect. And I'll give somebody else a chance, but I'll come back and tell you some of the principles that the International Council on Active Aging advises for us to address this.
Okay, thank you very much, Mrs. Richards-Leader. I now invite Mr. Anthony Mills from the St. Kitts and Nevis Association of Persons with Disability. Now, Mr. Mills, how has gender-based violence impacted your group?
Well, a lot of what has been said so far applies to people with disabilities, because let's not lose sight of the fact that at the end of the day, people with disabilities are just people, right? And because in a lot of the institutions where you would file complaints and stuff like that, there's no, like, let's say if somebody can't speak and they go to make a complaint, the police don't understand what they're saying. There's no police officer or somebody trained in sign language. There's nobody on call who they could call and say, well, come and interpret for us. So a lot of the times what happens is that people with disabilities would encounter violence against them and not report it. So a lot of it goes unreported. And like older people, a lot of it is at the family level. Young people with disabilities, elder people with disabilities are abused by their own families, emotionally sometimes, just because maybe they can't do things the way other people would do it, and then you get talked to in certain ways where that becomes emotional abuse. And a lot of financial abuse goes on with people with disabilities, because people tend to think that you can't manage your own money. So in their misguided way, they manage your money but not in your best interest. You know? And a lot of that happens with people with disabilities. And then our funds are limited in a lot of ways, because most people with disabilities don't have a job. You know, so they depend on either family members to help them out, who most of the time would reach to this point and then, well, I can't do it no more, so that person suffers, or they depends on government checks, and then there's people who would take these checks from them. So, and then we have heard cases of women with disabilities being raped, and it's never brought to the authorities' attention, because a lot of the time the authorities don't even believe it. You know, so you have that problem where the institutions, I agree with Mr. Leader that there needs to be policy changes, because we as people with disabilities, we pretty much don't have a say. We don't have a representative at the table when the decisions are being made. So to voice what works best for us. Because let's look at like the Bastia police station. I wouldn't be able to enter it to make a complaint.
There's no access.
You know, there's no access. And when in terms of information, there's a lot of information disseminated. Let's look at like now. We are on here, we are discussing gender-based violence, but there's nobody doing sign language. So a person who needs sign language interpretation can look at this program and know what's going on. They depends on somebody to explain it to them, and then they might not get it right, you see. So we have to look at it not just in terms of the violence that happens, but how can we avoid it? How can we put stuff in place that when things happen, it can be adequately addressed? Because if it's not being addressed, then people think that they get away with it. And once people think that they get away with it, they will do it again, you know. So we as people with disabilities, and not just women with disabilities, even though they encounter a lot more than us males with disabilities, but people with all disabilities, male and female, encounter violence against them, you know. I had this young man, he works at the airport, and somebody just hit him in the head just because. Himumu, that they say. You know, that's what the word they use. Himumu. And then there was nothing that the police did about it. You know. Because you find a lot of the times, even at the family level, where people look at people with disability as less than, and because of that fact, you know, a lot of stuff happens, and the person themselves don't report it because they're scared. They're scared that when they go home, then the family member who did it in the first place going to do some kind of retaliation, and they have no place to go. There's not a, like, you have a home where you could take abused children. There's not a place where you could take abused people with disabilities.
Yes, same as everyone.
You know, so you have to go back to the same home where the abuse is happening, whether it's financial, emotional, physical, but you have to live in that environment, you know, because there's no way to take you out of that environment. So these are some of the things that they need to, and I'm hoping that when we do get to the point where we can bring a national policy on disability to the parliament, that things like that would be included in it, and that it wouldn't be done without the full inclusion of people with disabilities, because we as advocates, we have a saying that's nothing about us without us, you know, because if you don't talk to us, 9 out of 10 times you get it wrong. So you have to have us at the table addressing the violence, addressing the abandonment, because what happens sometimes, people with disabilities, they're just left at home by themselves, you know. Nobody come in because maybe the family can't afford to pay somebody to come in. And I remember during the COVID lockdown, we had a couple of our members who called to say, well, nobody from social services came to visit them to see how they were doing, how they were getting along. And they had issues where they couldn't get their prescriptions because they couldn't get out and go get the prescriptions. So, you know, these are things that need to be addressed, you know, because really and truly some of the isolation is not just by family, you know, it's by the society, it's itself, you know. And these things, if we don't address them, it's only going to get worse, you know. We have, as a country, have signed and ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but we have not begun the full implementation of it. And if you look at it, there's an article in it that talks about violence against women and girls, you know, and that would help us to address that when it comes to people with disabilities. Not only, we also have to incorporate that into the whole gender policy of the country, because women and girls with disabilities are just women and girls. So whatever policy you would put in place to address violence against women, it must include violence against women and girls with disabilities.
Yes, and as Mrs. Leader mentioned earlier, gender is not just about women. Gender is both women and men, girls and boys. Right? It's about, you know, a social construct.
But when you think about abuse, Mr. Williams, you know, most abusers, if you come down to the nitty-gritty, they're really cowards. They're people who, and they've got this false sense of ego that they could do things to anyone and get away with it. I think that at policy level, the people who sit and make or advise the legal teams, they should be sensitized. As we say in research, they should become native. They should go in and see what happens. And then they could give a very rational and honest opinion on what it should be. I mean, like Mr. Mills is saying, how could you advise a minister on disabilities or help for this if you yourself hasn't taken time out to go and see how they live and how they survive in it? I have had people say to me, I would really like my mom to be cared for because it's hard for me, but you know, her pension goes to pay the mortgage. Well, I mean, that is financial abuse in every way that we can, and because that person has already cared for their family. Their little pension is you're supposed to be. I mean, we're in a different world. I mean, I know that from my first paycheck, I cared for my mom. You know, you had that pride of going home and giving her something. But it seems like, you know, in these days you have a child you have a child for your life and his life, and nothing comes back. It's a one-way stream. Society has changed, and I'm not saying that we should go back to that way, but surely you need to ask the people with the experience. We don't have one gerontologist in this country, yet every year so many people go to Cuba. Cuba has got one of the best gerontology systems in the world, but nobody is interested in, well, I think there's one lady there now who specializes in that, thank God. Because look, the old people have already lived their time. I have had doctors who say, why are you so worried? This person is 80-something years old. Well, I have nurse residents who are 103 and 105. And in fact, they died without having any forms of dementia. So the chronological age sometimes has nothing to do with defining this person as, as an elderly or older adult. We need to be more respectful. When I was a child, I knew the name of every old person in my village. We had to sweep their yard, wash their dishes, run over in recess time, and so forth. I know it can't go back to that, but where is the respect? Where is the respect? Yeah? So.
Okay. Now, what has the response been? Or what kind of response would you like to see in terms of the gender-based violence and its impact upon your group? Mrs. Carr. Miss Carr. I don't know why I keep saying Mrs. You're Miss Carr.
Miss Carr, or you could just simply say Grace.
Right, Grace.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. There's so much that has been said at this table that just rubs you the wrong way. All of us are so interconnected, Mrs. Leader, that I wanted to almost chime in when you're speaking, because
that's okay,
the whole matter of society has changed. The basic needs of our society hasn't changed, though. Respect, love for one another, taking the high road, doing unto others what you'd have them do unto you. Those are things that are generational. It runs from one generation to the other. But what I find that has changed is that very often our leaders or the state, we have laws on the books and they are not enforced, But let me get back to the community for which I have been asked that question. What I find, especially as it relates to migrant women, are that people are very culturally insensitive to their needs. A woman, she might find herself in a country, some persons have probably overstayed, for whatever reason, that is not the issue. People address them and see them as persons who they can sexually disadvantage because they are holding, just putting it colloquially, you are holding the handle and they have the blade in their hand because they are not able to fend for themselves economically. And so sometimes they get themselves in relationships with men that are unfavorable, and they hold this economic power over them because they are not from here. Some of them, they don't speak the language. But there are centers or there are faith-based community services that people can access. Certainly JAMKIT is one association that persons who are from the migrant community that they can align themselves with and get relief. Also, make information more accessible to persons. When I came here, I wasn't even aware that after you being here for a while that you could vote or even have a voter's ID or things like that. Mm-hmm. Information is not easily accessible. Just being more careful and putting yourself in another person's shoe is something that I'm sure that our migrant, and address people. I'm a Jamaican. I'm not Yadi. I'm a Jamaican. If you become my acquaintance, then, but just be culturally sensitive. I find that, for example, a lot of our population that are migrant persons that are here from the Spanish countries, Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, and other places, everybody is just blanketed as the Spanish them. I'm sure you've heard that. And that's just being culturally insensitive to individuals.
They're not Spanish, they're Hispanic.
There is an absolute. Thank you,
Spanish
Mr.
people are people from Spain.
That's
Hey,
right.
that's
That's
what
right. That's right.
That's what I mean.
But the answers
And
are
so
clear.
we also, what I'd love to see is stricter, and not only just for migrant women, but stricter and harsher punishment for perpetrators. I listened to, what's my Palinist name again, Mr. Mills,
Mills, yeah.
and my heart just kind of just fell within me, because I'm saying, if it is that you want to go to any of the police stations, they are not wheelchair accessible. We have to get to that place where we talk about 2030 vision, but a lot of our Caribbean islands, we are not third world country, you know, because even Jamaica, and I'm a Jamaican, and I speak proudly as a Jamaican. There are a lot of things that we were front runners of in Jamaica, even before places in the United States. But what is third world about us is our attitude. Or attitude towards each other, or attitude to law, and that sort of thing. We have the capability and the wherewithal, but we need the will. We need the will to do what we are supposed to do by our elders, by our persons with disability, by our migrant population, and also by our women and children.
But you know, somebody like me who's been a migrant nearly all my life, from the age of 18, one of the things that I think an association like JAMKIT needs to be able to do is to set up little orientation
Yes,
classes for
we have
your
meetings.
people.
Yes, we have been doing
I
that.
have about 6 Jamaicans working for me.
And you've heard any of them ever mention about JAMKIT meetings?
Yes, they
Because
do.
Yes,
but the
okay.
thing is, I have heard them call themselves yardies. Near yardie.
Yeah,
Okay?
yes,
So you need to tell them that they need to have self-respect.
yes.
I've had some of them who've been here for 3 years, and I'm the first person who discussed with them about a social security card, or even sponsoring them with a work permit, because they were quite happy working and not paying their social security and so forth. In fact, last week one of them said, you know, you're the person who really enlightened me. Yep, she's here for 3 years, and so forth.
Information.
Yeah. If they come to me for a job and they've been delinquent, they're going to go up to National Security and pay their debt. Yeah? That's not ill-treating them.
Yes.
That's being honest, that's being legal, and that's also caring for my country. If you owe debt, you have to pay it. Because if they get ill and they go to the hospital, then, you know, it takes money. But I quite agree with you on that when people feel vulnerable, sometimes they let their guard down.
Yes.
And they accept things that they would not normally do. And if you put it back in terms of somebody who's disabled, somebody who's old with morbidities, and don't forget the banks. It's only in recent time that you see a ramp by a bank. So when these people want to go and get their money, they had to sit outside and trust somebody to go in and get this money for them.
Yes.
You know? And it's only when people start getting their pension. Lord, nothing have friends, so people who wouldn't even ring them up on a Sunday and ask if you want a plate of food. As soon as they know you have a pension, if you come from Canada, England, and America, it's even worse. You have friends, it's a thing, because they want to exploit you materially and financially. The government needs to take a stand. Sometimes we have to do things up, down. But I think for 20 years I've been begging for an elder abuse law. Well, if the law is taken, most developed countries have an elder abuse law. They call it all type of things, Gerontology Act and blah, blah, blah. It's not there. We need to put it in place. Look at how many centenarians a small island federation like us have. It's in the teens. That's the amount of, at one time we had, I think, 17. I don't know how many we have now. But people are living longer.
I can't recall so many.
Yes, I think they were, yeah, they were. And then they were 15, and I don't know how many they have now. But at one time, they had, when Jovial was there and Azilla was there, they had that many. I don't know how much it is now, because the link is. But when I was teaching the programs, of course, I had to know it so that I could be accurate. But whatever, You know, you're not going to get old without having some type of disability, because everything in life is a trade-off. You live to 80, you're going to be hard of hearing, you're going to have this deficit, whatever. Please let us put in place all these things to avoid abuse of all of us. And actually, you know, when you look at this thing about gender, even men are abused.
Yes,
you know?
Yes.
I think a lot of it comes down to education.
Yes.
Yes.
And I think our society need some sort of re-education, because
Constant
Yes.
education.
we tend to write
Yes.
off
Yeah.
certain subgroups, like we tend to write off the elderly because they're old now, so they need to stay out of the
And call
way.
them shut-ins.
Yeah, and you tend to write off people with disabilities. I still have people asking me why I don't stay home, you know, till the day of today.
To your face?
Yeah. I mean, why would I want to stay home and continue looking at the walls 24/7? You know, the room seems to get smaller when you just shut in, as they like to say. And people tend to think that it's best if you have somebody looking after you when you're quite capable of looking after
That's
yourself.
Right. That's right.
You know, so these are a lot of the things that we need to change, because when people tend to feel that it's better if you have somebody looking after you, then a lot of times abuse come into it, because the person who feel that obligation to be looking after you, and they don't get to live their life the way they would want it,
But
because
their
they feel
personality
like,
clash.
yeah,
Their
you know.
personality clash. It doesn't matter how much you love that, but your personality clash
Exactly.
with your own children.
So
Yeah.
we have to look at doing things differently. We have to ensure that we put policies in place, and not just at social affairs and gender affairs level, but we have to look across the different ministries. Social security have a part to play. Labor department has a part to play, because people are living longer. People with disabilities, a lot of the time people don't believe me when I tell them people with disabilities, most of us are not sick people. It's not like we're sick. And then people like to say, oh, you're suffering from blindness. Blind people don't suffer. They just happen to can't see. It's not because they're sick. A person in a
Differently
wheelchair might be
abled.
more healthier than a lot of other people. But because of how our society is, remember, we just started seeing people with disabilities out in the street and going about their business. Used to be you have a disability, you're at home, somebody come in, they give a little piece of food, and they give the hand-me-down clothes them, and it still happens. But, you know, a lot of that is changing, but our society needs to understand that young people with disabilities currently are being undereducated. You know, a lot of people don't like to hear me say it, but it's true. They're being undereducated because we have this sort of one-size-fits-all education for persons with disabilities, and it don't work like that, because some are able to learn at a higher level, and you should give them that opportunity. And so to end some of the discrimination, there needs to be more, like, I don't know if you would want to say more forums, more education, more outreach, and that has to begin at the government level and across the government, not just specifically to certain ministries, but it has to be across the
And it's got to be all-inclusive. It's got to be private. We still have this thing, which in a way, you know, it's quite discriminatory when you have the them and us, yeah? So you're not going to include people from the private sector.
Yes,
because
it's collaborative.
it's got nothing to do with them. That's where the knowledge base is. And until we go there, and going back to about wheelchair, you know, working in England and managing midwifery there for a number of years, the amount of women in wheelchair have delivered both normal delivery and cesarean section. They're married, they're coming with their partner, sometimes they come. You know, it doesn't be just because you're in a wheelchair, just because you look a certain way.
You're just differently able.
People with Down
Yes.
syndrome, people with autism, their body doesn't stop working.
Right.
You know, and I think that's what we need to appreciate in our little country, because we're
Yes,
so educated. We're so
yes,
educated.
because sometimes we have we have ageism.
Yes.
Of course, we're discrimination towards people who are older. We have discrimination towards people who are have disabilities, and we have discrimination against migrants.
But Mr.
And we see that, and sometimes people even think that people who are older do not have feelings. For example, don't have sexual feelings. They're human beings, or people who are disabled that don't. People try to deny certain vulnerable groups, even what belongs to them as human beings.
And they even look at
Their humanity.
Yeah.
Yes.
like a person with a disability in a relationship. Somebody always wants to think that the other person is taking advantage of them, or they must be taking advantage of the woman there, they must be taking advantage of the man, because it's almost like they think you're not capable of being involved in a romantic relationship.
Right.
I don't, Mr. Williams, just to interject.
Just before you make your point, though, I want to open the phone lines.
Oh, okay.
So if people want to call in, and then we'll continue the discussion. We're going to open the lines. The numbers to call are 466-2666, 662-8674, 767-4765, 1-239-645-4500. That's 1-239-645-4500. We await your call.
Yes, Mr. Williams, I don't want us to rush off from this discussion without pinning down in terms of responsibility and accountability. Who is listening? A lot of information, invaluable information, is being shared right here at this table as it relates to things that we can do. Who is taking note in terms of the persons who we have elected as leaders in some of these capacities or ministries? Who is being held accountable for? Who's dropped the ball? Essentially, who has dropped the ball? Question to you, sir, or question to the rest of us. Who has dropped the ball? It's all of us. All of us.
I think many people in society have dropped the ball, and there has to be a paradigm shift.
Yes.
In terms of how people think. There needs to be a paradigm shift in terms of the politics of power.
Yes.
There needs to be a shift in terms of, gender balance,
yes,
gender equality, and all of that. So it has to be an all of society approach. Because when you have discrimination, when you have marginalization, and so on, that affects the entire development of the society.
Yes.
And it affects the country.
Yes.
Right? And so therefore, you have to have the inclusion of everybody in terms of the development of the country and development of people. And, when you have abuse and when you have, people who are seen to be vulnerable, that they are marginalized and that their rights are being sidelined and so on,
all of us
then
suffer.
that is not inclusion, it's exclusion, and it affects the development of the country.
The society and
I'm going to give you a personal example of discrimination. In 1996-97, when I had already had all the plans for the Grange and we had secured the land where it is now, the last thing was to get some help financially. I had some money, but of course I didn't just want to come and build anything. I wanted a real good template of what housing the elderly should be. So I started going around to banks, and my now husband was helping me. And anyway, I put my business plan to this particular bank, and I kept going and coming from England, and sometimes they would give me appointments, and when I reached, the person was off island, and blah, blah, blah. And I came on this particular day, and this bank manager, she saw us, And we went in, and he was in his chair like this, and said, so we told him, you know, you have the our business plan, and he said, yeah, I read it, and then he started to laugh, and he said,
Too familial.
he said, you think I'm going to give you the bank money to tackle your billing? And I said, nobody going to put the parents in there. I can't give you the bank money to build old people home.
Lack professionalism.
So I said to him, I said, that's fine. Can I please have my plan back? And we left, and we continued our search. However, 8 years into the Grange, he rang me telling me that he's having a lot of problems caring for his mom, and could I help him? Unfortunately, I didn't have a space, and he was actually quite shocked that so many had put
The elderly in the
But
home.
you know what I did? I reached out because he had someone who was helping him, and I trained the person.
Wow.
I trained them and set them back to care for his mom.
We have to always take the high road.
And sometimes you can't fight fire with fire. And I know that he remembered what he told me. I've never said, you remember when you say this, because that does not help. And I went 110 to make sure that the lady was comfortable. And I'm sure he's learned a lesson. That is the depth. I mean, many, many times I felt like just giving up and staying where I was. But I'm pretty sure. And at that point, you could see that nobody was being strategic. You look around and you see people getting older and older and older, but they're still not strategic. And we dropped the ball in many ways. And, you know, we don't want to point fingers because I suppose in a lot of ways we're all guilty, you know, to some degree.
True.
Of not doing enough. One of the things here too is that when you want to say something constructive, it goes over as criticism, that people are not very open-minded. So whatever you say, oh, she criticized, who she think she be? I think Singing Jackie had a song on that, who she think she be? And all these type of stuff. You know, people have said to me, why you don't go back to England? And, you know, all this nonsense, rather than looking at it and saying, yeah, you know, this is a problem. This is a problem that we're having. Thank God the BNTF and Mr. D'Souza came on board and realized that the training program was needed, and they funded us for three good sessions. Unfortunately, half of the people, I see them on the road selling their vegetables and so, which is okay. But you're going to take on such a course. You know, we spent a lot of money on it, and still the people, you know why? Because care of the elderly as a job is seen as lower than.
Yep.
You don't have dress down Fridays where they could, you know, all up and down in their jeans and blah, blah. And people come to the Grange and they see me in my uniform and they say, oh, me, I know you just do work. Well, I mean, you have to teach by example.
Exactly.
You know, you have to teach. You have to show people how. You cannot teach care of the elderly on a mannequin. Okay? People have to be out there, seeing what's done. Ask Celia, she did the course. You have to be out there. Here the people, you know, when the people with dementia abuse you, they call you all type of names under the sun. You can't say, oh, me ain't gonna feed you. You have to understand what dementia is. A mannequin don't do that.
Sure.
A mannequin is not gonna call you the most degrading thing on earth. You just take me husband, go away, you know, and all this type of stuff. So we need to get real. We need to get real. Stop this competition about who am I and I am this, and nobody cares about your designation when it comes to prejudice and when it comes to designation. I mean, you know, to care. Let us get real. Let us look at what is staring us in the face and address it.
Yes. Now, what has the support been? Because while we speak about vulnerable groups, they don't require the same level of support. They require even more support because of the vulnerabilities. not less support, but more support.
They require true advocates.
Yes, and true advocates on their behalf. What has that been? What kind of support have you received? You know, Mr. Mills.
As an advocate for people with disabilities, what I've found a lot of the times is people don't really listen. People don't, because they tend to tell. I remember one time I was speaking to somebody who worked for government, and I was talking about housing for people with disabilities. And his response was, well, nobody's stopping her from applying. So I had to.
The house is built.
That is what I had to bring to his attention. If you set up a project and there is no floor plan that addresses people with disabilities need, then in effect you are telling us not to apply.
Exactly.
It's like we've been asking for years for them to revise our building codes. Because what happens is that you build a building and you claim that you're not stopping us from coming into the building, but you put a flight of stairs at the entrance. And even when sometimes there might be a ramp at the entrance, it's not built properly. And then the building will have a second floor, but there's no way to get to the second floor.
Yes.
So
just let me put a pin in there. When I taught at CFBC, I used to see a mother who would put her son, who was disabled, on her back and take him up the flight of stairs just so that he can be at class. And we can say, oh, it's very admirable that she does that. But we need to ask the questions. Why isn't there a ramp or a lift or something like that? Instead of just saying and clapping the mother and saying, oh, she's doing such a marvelous job, we need to ask the question.
But you also need to ask another question. What if she wasn't willing to do that there?
Or able
to do it.
What if she was not able is another question.
Yes, so then what would have become of his education? Because remember, she did that from preschool to Clarence Fitzroy. Across all, he went to Sandy Point High. And she had to do that while he was in Sandy Point High, while he was in St. Paul's Primary. Through school. So what if she wasn't able to do that or willing to do that? You know, we have to look at what the type of education.
And the question that must be asked, should education come at such a price?
Well, we as advocates for people with disabilities, we advocate that all of the schools be made accessible and all of the assistive technologies be put into place. Because, okay, there's a system called the Education Network, but there's no assistive technology built into it. So that people with disabilities with certain disabilities won't be able to access that system, right? And then the schools are inaccessible and teachers are not trained to deal with people with certain disabilities. So you find that the only option for a young person with a disability is to go to a specific school where the curriculum is not at the same standard as the other schools. So then that causes them to be undereducated, you know. And so these are things that we have to look at and try to make changes.
Mr. Williams, you brought that particular situation to the fore. I don't know how long ago that was, but has the situation been rectified?
It has not been very long ago. This would have been like in 2016, 2017. So let's say 20, at least 2 or 3 years ago.
But apart from that,
who is addressing
what is it doing or has done to that mother's health?
Exactly.
And if she is the prime caregiver, I don't know the case, for that child,
But
we are shortening her lifespan. And if she goes, who's going to care for him?
Which goes back to
it could be 5 or 6 years
This
of
thing has
time.
very wide implications. What is it? It's not easy taking.
It's about 6 years.
It's about
because
6 years.
But it goes back to
I remember
it goes
when
back
we were trying to help him to get a job. He's finally gotten a job
He's
at
working.
the hospital. And one of the problems in him getting a job is access. To
Access.
most of the places where he could have gotten a job. So
Right.
because the hospital is a little more accessible, he has now gotten a job. But nobody has done nothing to change the situation where that another parent wouldn't have to go through that there. You know.
You know, and we may not look at it in the traditional view that is really abuse.
Of course it's abuse. It's abuse and
It's abuse. It's really not nobody coming and hitting you or anything like that, but it is really abuse.
lack of caring is abuse. You
But
don't
you see,
feel that?
it goes back to the point that Mr. Williams made earlier, that some of the groups of vulnerable individuals, if they continue to be in those vulnerable positions, it affects all of us. Because as Mr. Mill says, what if, and all of us agreed, what if that mother didn't have the willpower or the strength to be able to do so? And as you said, Madam, if it is that she becomes ill, who carries on the whole family? You know, so once we move towards eliminating some of these vulnerable groups, then all of us as a society, we rise. We rise.
I think prejudice is so inherent that some of us take it for now, and we don't call it prejudice or discrimination.
Or abuse.
Or abuse. But because it's become part of the system.
Yes.
And it feels normal. You
Yeah,
know.
people
And it's so
normally,
familial, you know, it's so familiar, and we're all...
People-
yes.
people like to prey on what they view is weaker.
Because it's power. It's about power.
It's, and you know, it's really about power. I am more powerful than you,
Yeah.
and so therefore I can prey on you. And that is what abuse really is. Abuse is about people using their power to hurt other people.
And hurt people hurt people.
Yeah, it's the weakest
Yes.
link, isn't it? It's like playing the
It's
weakest
really a
link.
it's really a weakness link.
Yeah.
So the question that must be asked
And
is,
answered.
what is weak about a person in a wheelchair? What is weak about someone who is a migrant? What is weak about an older person? They perhaps have some strengths that you don't have. But everything is really confined in a certain thing to the physical, sometimes to ethnicities and race and class and so on. And, you know,
If
you don't have to be hitting anybody, but the name calling. For example, even with the LGBTQ communities and so on.
Yes, yeah.
There's a lot of violence taking place in terms of
Towards them.
songs and what people are saying and the names that people are being referred to, and nobody is seeing it as violence.
No,
But it is really violence.
Of course it is. It is.
Insensitivity.
And another thing is, you see, when you're asking about what is weak, is that we make these people weak because we break their spirits. We make them feel lesser than. We make them feel demoralized. We make them feel in all this type of stuff. And it's
Yes,
just...
and that is where the emotional abuse, the emotional and psychological abuse, it necessarily doesn't have to be physical. But when you make people feel that they are less than,
They behave that way.
And that's where associations like yours could come in to give people,
A space, a safe space,
people-
and direction.
yes,
Yes.
because
and
after
support.
a while they start demeaning their own selves.
Yes,
Like
yes.
one of them telling me, you know, me a yardie. I said, no, that doesn't go here. you know, you have a nationality. I don't know about that nationality. So after people tell you something, after a while, you really start believing.
Yes, even if you're
that
not
you
saying it
are
in
that
jest.
way. Yes.
Yes,
Okay,
because
it
very
starts
often,
sinking
you
in.
know, sometimes people refer to you, but as I said, it depends on the relationship that I have with the person. It can be understood. But if it is that you're just being culturally insensitive towards me, that is something that I would shun. You know, so those are things that we have to help person to be more self-aware. You know, empowerment and self-preservation is something that we have to, in these communities and association, assist our migrant women
Also
and
the
children
law.
to
The law should come into
yeah.
force as to why a lot of these migrant women especially are paid less. A lot of them are paid less than the minimum wage.
Yes.
And they accept that because, for one, you know, they're glad for a job and so forth. But people should not be breaking the law just because they think somebody really want a job.
A job
and so
to
forth. So
economic,
there's always
economic,
education
this
to go
comes, yeah.
to, you know, that they need to understand as well. But human beings generally are just racist and discriminatory. I mean, I lived and worked in Kenya for 6 years, and they have got 42 different tribes and 100 different dialects. And although they're Kenyans, they find little silly things
a lot of classism
to
is there.
discriminate against. So you would find the Kikuyu tribe who are the most affluent, the Kikuyu and Luos who are most affluent and educated and so forth, would say that they're not marrying to this person. And they would not say it because of the tribe, but they would say, oh, because their men are not circumcised, or some ridiculous thing in there.
There's a lot of traditional
But
things.
yeah, you know, anywhere I've lived in this world, I've seen it. But when it comes to this state where it's actually damaging people physically and emotionally, that's where the problem is. I just want us as a nation to just start loving each other, whether for whatever views we have, whatever views we might have, everybody's got their rights. And, you know, it's about having choices. Whatever choice you make doesn't mean to say, well, if you believe in this, then I'm not going to give you this. Be it religious, political, or whatever, at the end of it, it comes down to us being human beings. And as long as we're breathing, we need to be given good care. That's
Yes.
all.
Now, a lot of what we are talking about, if it is to end or more awareness, of course, there needs to be more investment, there needs to be more leadership, and there needs to be more action. Now, Chanel, the Department of Gender Affairs, does a lot of work with vulnerable groups. What type of help is being provided by the Department of Gender Affairs?
Well, Gender Affairs falls under the umbrella of social services. So within the ministry itself, we have some other partners that we work along with. Well, for Gender Affairs, we work along with Special Victims Unit very, very closely. So, because most of the times, Ms. Leader, you know, at the end of all of it, we're looking for justice. At the end of it. We work along with community development as well, because those are the persons who go out to the community and look after the elders within the community. So we work along closely with community development as well. Community development is a unit under our umbrella that provides for the elderly, whether it's food, or they would go and assist them physically to help to pay bills, or to maybe wash clothes, or to see how they are doing, or to get medication. For us also, we work along with the legal aid. For example, the migrant women.
Yes, if there's any challenge with their
right,
legal
their
status.
challenges, right, that they are facing, you know, they work
Are there
along.
numbers that are made public, for example, on some of these programs that are
Yes.
repeated, you know, in the news, or in
Yes.
what forum can these
We have,
information be found?
the information is found on our website, on our Facebook page. It's found on posters that we post around the place. Like for 16 Day, we have posters around, and the posters have our numbers. We have ads on the TV also that will be coming out shortly, and there are numbers also. For example, too, we also have probation and child protection services that if you're a migrant woman and you are here with a child and you think that you need help, they're there.
Would you consider having a register of caregivers rather than having anybody just thrown in without reference? You know the amount of people come to
Definitely.
me who's got police records?
Definitely, because we need to know, as you say, about police
Bank, yeah,
record.
job
We
bank.
need to know that they are trained, they know how to deal with the elderly persons. Of course, and that is very important. I know my permanent secretary is listening and she's taking notes as well, right?
You said you had a
I
special
once-
victims unit?
Yes.
I once rang that department and said that I had concerns about someone who was working for me and I caught her stealing. And I was told, okay, we'll wait until she steals anything. That is what I was told. And it ended up that she continued stealing. This is the type of things that I'm telling you. That here you have somebody put in authority to defend the elderly, and you're making a joke of it. You're just,
Okay.
One more thing, and the department also works along with our NGOs, and as Ms. Clark rightly said, faith-based organizations. There are many
Salvation.
churches around the island that we have to work with, where we have gotten shelter, we have gotten clothes, they have even gotten money. So there's what we call partners that we work along with within the department. Most times people would say, what is gender affairs and what do they do? But Mr. Williams, we're here every year, twice a year, 3 times a
I
year.
think you all do a good
Different
job.
platforms are here. So we are here.
you do a good job.
Yes. When they say that they don't know what gender affairs do, we're up Victoria Road. You can come up Victoria Road, you can call us, you can find out, what are the types of services that we provide under the ministry.
There's one thing, when I came here to St. Kitts 2015, August of 2015, I noticed that you didn't have many persons of unsound mind on the road, but the numbers are increasing. Is there an area for quote unquote, for want of a better word, mentally challenged?
Yeah, there's a mental health
Yes,
unit.
there's a day center.
Yeah, there's a day
Day
center.
Where are those?
Buckley's.
Buckley's?
I'll give you the information.
Yes, and given the COVID-19
Yes.
pandemic in which we are in, you have mental health issues have increased.
Increase,
Yes.
it has. It
Because
has.
of the same thing.
Domestic violence
Because of the
issues
same thing.
have been increased.
Yes.
Got people locked up in homes and
People are losing their jobs.
and losing
you
their
know,
jobs
yeah,
and so on.
forth.
The frustration and so is building, and you're locked up in a house with somebody you would rather not want to
And
be
to
locked
be,
up in.
yeah.
You know,
It's true.
you usually would have you to go out to the bars and what's not and what's not, but being there all the time, tension can build and,
What-
and
what-
so on, and these things can happen.
Yeah, what I found was part of the theme for this year's United Nations for what we are celebrating or talking about: funding, respond, prevent, and collecting. Just to piggyback on what Mr. Williams just spoke about a while ago, are you in a position to show the numbers, or to is there data that has been collected to show the increase or decrease thereof of some of the things that we're talking about, the domestic violence, especially since COVID?
There really is.
It has been.
There really is data, but the data has to be interpreted.
Yes.
That's true.
And we can have the raw data, but it has to be interpreted. But of course, the police,
It's not disaggregated
The
in
po-
terms of
But I would-
women, the elderly.
But generally, I
disabled
didn't necessarily,
persons,
but generally just
women and the types of abuse.
abuse has increased, especially since the
Yes,
COVID.
yes.
Since
yes,
Definitely.
the police,
Yes.
the police has said that.
I would like to look at it
So,
specifically
for example,
to people with disabilities.
What has transpired since
What-
COVID?
Yeah, because this year's International Day of Persons with Disabilities theme is building back better. And for people with disabilities to rebound, when you look, because of the fact that we have always been behind, the curve in a way. We have, if we're going to be building back better, we have to know what services are available as far as gender affairs and Ministry of Social Affairs, which Social Affairs is the ministry that is charged with people with disabilities, right? Yeah. So we have to look at the data in terms of specific to people with disabilities. I mean, even though that most things affect us, sometimes you have to look at it.
It's not generic.
Specifically.
It's not generic. Everybody's got individualized thing.
People with disabilities needs are different in a lot of ways, right? So I would like to sort of hear you address it in terms of people with disabilities, specific to people with disabilities.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, we can go on and we can go on, but I must tell you, we are out of time.
Went very well.
The time went by very, very quickly. It was a nice discussion. And we need to have more discussions like this. Yeah. Because let's face it, we can have all the infrastructure in the world.
I know.
We can say that we have high GDP, we have surplus, and all of that. But that element which really touches in terms of human rights and human development, that is what makes societies. That is what makes countries. The respect for people who are different, differently abled, the respect for migrants, people of different ethnicities, races, religions, all of that sort of a thing. It is then that we have a society, a model society, where we have respect, equal rights, and justice for everybody. And that is really what we should be able to boast about as a society, not simply in terms of the good roads and the whatever, because at the end of the day, those things serve no purpose if it's not for helping with the whole area of human development. Because that is at the center of any form of development, human development, how we treat others, how we respect others. And that is what we are here to discuss this afternoon. The real litmus test of any society is how it treats its most vulnerable and weakest members. That is the real litmus test of any society. And if you want to know what a society is, look at how it treats minorities, people who are vulnerable, people who are seen as being weak, and so on. Women, children, minority groups, and so on. What are we doing to stop this? What are we doing as a society? I want to thank all of you. Chanel, Charles, who has been on this program a number of times and who is doing a very good job at the Department of Gender Affairs. And I see Mrs. Christopher, who is here today for her support. She's not on the panel, but she's here. Celia Christopher, the Director of the Department of Gender Affairs. And she, of course, is making sure that she hands on the baton to people in the Department of Gender Affairs. And that is about empowering others. We have to empower others. Thank you very much, Miss Grace Carr, for your representation here today, representing migrant women. You did say that you are a Jamaican.
Proudly so.
Proudly so.
Yes. And,
you know, we have some of these terms about Yardie and so on, but I see you as a Jamaican. Mrs. Patricia Richards-Leader, who is the CEO of the Grange Healthcare Facility. How we treat our older people, that's important. And sometimes it's not only older people that is in a healthcare facility.
Absolutely.
I have
And she
someone.
did say
I
that.
have someone there who's my age.
Right, but that is the stigma that is attached.
Yes. Okay.
And we have Mr. Anthony Mills, who represents the St. Kitts and Nevis Association of Persons with Disabilities. Thank you to all of you for coming today and for sharing with us how really we can look at and stem the tide of violence, gender-based violence towards the vulnerable population. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you to all of our listeners to today's program. Next week we'll be back with another edition of Working for You. Until then, I am Les Wall Williams. Take care.